So the impetus to organize this event came from a sense that inequalities are prevalent in classical music, as they are in the cultural sector, as they are in society at large, also in the UK, not only elsewhere in the world. But inequalities are rarely discussed. And we wanted to change this and found that this year's Arts and Humanities Festival would be a great opportunity to hold such an event. So the festival's theme, Underground, we found goes very well with our sense that inequalities often remain hidden and unspoken in classical music. So tonight, we want to uncover these inequalities, and we'll do so through talks, but also in and through music. We'll first be able to enjoy a performance by Ayanna Witter-Johnson, which will be followed by 3 10-minute presentations from Anna Bull, Beverly Mason, and myself. And then we'll have another performance by Ayanna, and then Alice Farnham will speak, and then Jessica Duchin. And afterwards, there'll be time for questions, hopefully, and for a bit of a discussion, which will then swiftly continue over a glass of wine here in Tutus, which you're all very warmly invited to. So don't run away. Wait till you get your wine, if you drink alcohol anyways. Okay, so it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Ayanna Witter-Johnson. She is a vocalist, a cellist, a pianist, a songwriter, and composer. Nominated for a 2012 MOBO Award, her live shows chronicle her experience as a woman in the 21st century. Having graduated from Trinity College of Music with a first-class degree in classical composition, she won a scholarship to complete a master's degree in composition at Manhattan School of Music. Ayanna's subsequent portfolio career has included, amongst many other things, participating on LSO's Discovery Panoptic Young Composer Scheme and becoming an emergent artist in residence at South Bank Center. As an orchestrator and arranger, Ayanna has worked with the LSO on Belief and the BBC Symphony Orchestras on Urban Classic. Welcome, Ayanna.
In 1851, Sojourner Truth made a speech at the Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio. That man over there says that women need help. Into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place anyway. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or lifts me over ditches or gives me the best place anyway. Ain't I a woman? Look at these arms. I've plowed, planted, and gathered into vines. No man could heed me. Ain't I a woman? seen most of them sold. When I cried with my mother's grief, oh none but Jesus heard me. What is this thing they call intellect? Well, what's that got to do with women's rights and Negroes' rights? Ain't I a woman? Look at these arms. I've plowed, planted, and gathered into bonds. No man could heed me. Ain't I a woman? I can work as hard, oh yes, and eat as much as man. Oh, and bear the lash. Ooh, yeah. But that little man over there, he says the women, they can't have rights as men, 'cause Christ wasn't a woman. No, I asked him, I said, where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? God and a woman, yes, man, had nothing to do with it, no. No. Ain't I a woman? Ain't I a woman? Ain't I a woman? Ain't I a woman? Thank you very much. I thought we'd start with a bang. Start with an intense number. So that was a speech given in 1851 by Sojourner Truth, who was born Isabella Bounfrey into slavery in 1797 in America. And she earned her freedom and spent the rest of her life sojourning around the States and giving speeches and empowering people. And she was actually the first black woman to win a court case in America at the time. Successfully, win a court case. So that's Sojourner Truth, if you want to go Google crazy.
we'll hear more music. We'll now hear from Anna Bull, who has worked as a pianist and cellist in New Zealand and Scotland with a variety of ensembles and programs, including the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, the New Zealand Chamber Orchestra, Live Music Now, and Scottish opera education. She is now engaged in PhD research, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, examining the pathways of young classical musicians to illuminate questions of class, authority, and bodily practice in classical music.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you so much to Ayanna. Is this on? Yep. Because I think starting with Sojourner Truth was just the best possible way to start this, this panel discussion. I really, really enjoyed that. So I'm just going to talk briefly about class and classical music in the UK. It feels like a bit of a downer after being relaxing into the music, but I'll try and keep it upbeat. I'm going to focus particularly on music education because that's where these inequalities are reproduced. My own research involved young people aged 16 to 21 playing in youth orchestras and youth choirs in the south of England, looking at the link between classical music and the middle classes. And in my research, I was quite nervous about introducing the question of class, especially I'm not English, as you can probably tell, so it's a bit of a minefield for a non-native to stride into. And the response I got from one girl, one of my participants, was, "Class? God, who talks in that way anymore?" So this response was from somebody who was firmly middle class. And I found that it was those of my participants in less privileged class positions, lower middle class, for example, who could actually see class and describe very astutely their own class position, while those who were middle class tended to see themselves as normal. And they weren't aware of class in the way that those from outside this position were. So this preamble is to point out the ways that some people see class and others don't. And of course, it can be a highly subjective matter. But I'm drawing on both people's own reading of their class position, as well as their parents' education, their jobs, and their own education, but also, crucially, their imagined futures, because class is also not about just what's in our past, but about where we can imagine going. And class is also about culture. There are very clear patterns of taste, what you like and don't like in terms of art and entertainment. I always have this argument with my sister who says, "No, but I just like it." And I'm like, no. We can actually map this very, very clearly onto your background. And of course, these patterns of taste are very clear when it comes to classical music. In terms of those who listen to classical music, a major sociological study from 2008 found that classical music was exclusively consumed by those in middle or upper class positions. And of course, as soon as I say this, there's always somebody who will tell me about their great uncle Leslie, who was a miner and loves going to the opera. There will always be exceptions, but the overall picture is clear. And looking at those who play classical music rather than listen to it, the picture is similar. Some forthcoming research into people who study music at university found that those who do music degrees are predominantly middle class, and those who do music production or music technology are, I think, about 90% working class boys. There's a very, very clear class divide. And there's also a recent report from the ABRSM which found that middle classes are much more likely to take private instrumental lessons. This won't be a surprise to anybody, I'm sure. So the question is not, is classical music played and listened to by the middle class? But why and how is it middle class? What is the nature of this link? And the prevailing explanations tend to be economic ones, suggesting that inequalities in classical music education are simply a question of access. If we give everyone access to instruments, good quality teaching, and progression routes, we'll have more role models from working class and ethnic minority groups, and then class will no longer be an issue. And clearly, economic barriers and role models are very important. However, I'm also going to suggest that these intersect with cultural and historical reasons why classical music remains middle class. So in fact, looking at the ABRSM report, which I mentioned earlier, the reasons that both children and adults give for not playing a musical instrument is that they're not interested in learning, or if they used to play, that they've lost interest in learning. Well, this was nearly half of the people who used to play an instrument. And by contrast, the cost of lessons was only the 7th most important factor for those who've given up playing. So we don't know why people have lost interest in playing, or indeed have never been interested at all. But what's clear from this particular survey is the biggest reasons why people don't play an instrument is not because it's too expensive, but because they don't want to. They're not interested. So, of course, there'll be many different reasons why this might be. I'm going to argue that one of the factors at play here might be that classical music has congruences with the middle classes and our particular cultural and value system. And this has a lot to do with the history of the middle classes in the 19th century in the UK, and the history of classical music education in the UK, which were also happening around the same time. So the grade exam boards and music conservatoires, which we've heard a little bit about today in the academic conference that has preceded this event, they were very formative in shaping the musical lives of my participants, and they were predominantly established in this very narrow window between about 1870 and 1893. And there's a surprising lack of research into the history of these institutions, but luckily we have one of the experts here in the room, Ayanna Johnson-Hill. And her research, as we heard earlier today, shows that the class divide, which was built into these institutions in the late 19th century, was around people who could read staff notation, so standard music notation, and these people were middle class, and those who used alternative notation systems, such as the tonic solfa method, which was widely used for choral singing in the 19th century, who were predominantly working class. The grade exams and music conservatoires used staff notation. So what's really interesting about this class divide between standard notation, as we call it now, and alternative notations is that it is still with us. And it is still a class divide. Today, alternative notation systems have changed. There might be guitar tabs or indeed music technology proficiency. And the study I mentioned earlier, looking at who does music degrees, who does music technology degrees, shows that this is about gender and class. It suggests that, broadly speaking, there is still a class divide around the ability to read standard staff notation. So why might this be? Partly as a result of this history, I'm going to show that there's a fit or a congruence between ways of learning classical music and middle class culture. And in order to do this, we need to draw on insights from education sociologists. I'm a sociologist, I don't know if I mentioned that. They've spent the last 40 years asking why certain groups, and the middle class in particular, do better at school than others. And they've conclusively demonstrated that mainstream education privileges the white middle classes over groups. It's a system of education which is designed around the same models of interaction and use of language which the middle classes use at home. So mainstream education was in effect designed by the middle classes for the middle classes, and school simply makes sense to a lot of middle class people. And we do better at it. So why is this relevant for music education? I'm going to draw on some research that's so hot off the press that it's not even published yet. And at our last conference in May, Mark Rimmer from the University of East Anglia talked about his ongoing research into In Harmony El Sistema, a program running in Norwich, Newcastle and Stoke-on-Trent, as well as other places. And so for those of you who don't know, El Sistema is a project that's been rolled out around the world, which brings classical music education to children in deprived areas. Mark's findings in this study are very interesting. He demonstrates that this fit between school culture and home culture that sociology of education has described was also reproduced in classical music education. The children who did well in these music education programs tended to also be those who did well at school and enjoyed school, crucially. This mirrors the link between those who do well at school also being the middle class children. This means that it's possible that the In Harmony Sistema programs could be reproducing the same inequalities which mainstream education produces. And why might this be? There are several similarities between classical music and mainstream education, which might lead to them both advantaging the same groups of pupils. So first, classical music and mainstream education are models of learning where the teacher or adult has more knowledge or skill than the child or learner. This might be necessary for school, but as we heard today from Christine Bates, music education is a space where the adult can be a facilitator rather than an authority. Secondly, they're both text-based, you're required to read something. And thirdly, it's a mode of practice where there's a clear sense of right and wrong. There is space for interpretation in classical music, but it's also, as I know from experience, possible to get it just plain wrong. And there's less room to play around and experiment than other genres. This exacerbates the authority between teacher and learner. And finally, the instruments used in classical music are difficult. Ayanna made it sound very easy, but I have a sense of how difficult it is to play the cello and sing at the same time. Wow. So these instruments need a long-term investment of time and effort from a learner who's able to believe in their future self as being able to do something that their current self cannot. So this requires a way of experiencing time which is long-term and future-oriented, where either the parents or the child can imagine and invest in a future and that it seems worth doing so. For those in less secure class positions, if you don't have financial security or housing or job security, it makes a lot less sense to plan long-term. So these are just some of the similarities with mainstream education, which tends to reward middle-class children, and classical music education. For lower middle class or working class people playing classical music, there's a particular value system which they have to buy into in order to progress. In my own research, for the lower middle class young people, classical music was often a route towards social class mobility to improve their class position. For some, it was a very welcome escape route out of the area they'd grown up in, a way to learn how to be middle class. However, they also talked about the correction and the improvement required in classical music, almost as though they were correcting themselves. This was a way to transform themselves into the ideal middle-class person that they saw represented by this music. The lower middle-class young people I spoke to in my research were also more likely to talk about being bullied by music teachers and to see this bullying as their own fault because they weren't good enough. They were trying to remake themselves to fit into this world, but this sometimes took a considerable toll on their mental health and their sense of self. So to conclude, what does all of this mean for the class inequalities in classical music that we see around us? I'd suggest that in order to shift these persistent inequalities, we need to change the musical practice itself and let the music evolve and change more. So as we heard in the conference which has preceded this event today, some music conservatoires are still following the same model they did 100 years ago, but others are changing their practices, getting students to play with musicians from other genres, to improvise, to learn how to use music technology. And with Ayanna's performance today, we've heard a fantastic and inspiring example of how traditions can adapt and change. And allowing this kind of experimentation will help with opening up this world to a more diverse and representative range of people. I'd like to see that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Our next speaker will be Beverly Mason. She is director at Medaseiden International, is a consultant researcher and advisor in the cultural and creative industries. Her professional background spans the development and leadership of various cultural and media business programs, leading on research, evaluation, marketing, facilitation, business, and board development. In one of her consultancy projects, she has been leading on research into the effective practices supporting musical progressions for ethnic minority young musicians into ensemble music making. She is also leading new research around entrepreneurship, business support, and access to finance for ethnic minorities in the music sector. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Christina, and I'd like to thank also Anna for that wonderful presentation. It leads very nicely into mine. And also wonderful performance by Ayanna, terribly inspiring, and I just could listen to more. I'm looking forward to hearing some more later on. Welcome everybody, thank you. I'm sitting up here feeling quite lacking in confidence and feeling a bit insecure because I'm a non-musician, and I think that one of the things that people feel is that there's something about the classical music world that kind of sets itself apart from the rest of the music sector. And that might be a good thing, that might be a bad thing, but on the other hand, it also means that sometimes people feel they can't really get access to or enjoy the music in a way that they perhaps should be enjoying the music. It's kind of, I heard these comments, I suppose, when I was conducting my research last year. It was commissioned by Tomorrow's Warriors, Kumba Youth Music, and the Royal Academy of Music. And the idea there was to really try and investigate and understand what were perhaps the barriers, the specific barriers that prevented young musicians from ethnic minority backgrounds into making a real kind of progression into developing themselves into careers as practicing musicians or musical young people. What I found in my research was that it was important to get a widespread of people working in the classical music sector, young people, practitioners, teachers, but also to talk to people who perhaps had stepped out of the sector. And I see in the room there are quite a few people who took part in the survey, took part in the focus groups today. I'd just like to share with you some of the highlights of the research. My kind of backstop for this was really to try and get to the grips with the kind of core stories, the core kind of arguments around research. And I think that the key sort of questions that we were asking about really across those six groups that I mentioned was whether people in their own experience felt that diversity was valued. Was it contextualized? Did people talk about the differences between race, between class and society in the school context? Did people talk about this in their work practices, whether in an orchestra, whether in an ensemble, whether we're working in the marketing department of an orchestral organisation, or perhaps a community organisation? And I wanted to have that conversation really broached to see whether those questions, which affect a lot of people who come from ethnic minority backgrounds and wider backgrounds, were actually in the wider domain. Because quite often, not having that conversation in of itself is a barrier. So I asked individuals to explore their own personal stories and to talk about their personal stories and to explore the kind of issues they may have faced and the kind of opportunities they were looking for and the kind of progression routes they may have wanted to take. And what I did find, generally speaking, was that there was a lot of change happening in the UK right now. But there's still a sense of that change wasn't happening fast enough. There are a lot of initiatives. We've talked about El Sistema. We've seen that there have been a lot of organisations who've been supported by orchestral organisations. There are a lot of kind of really positive, progressive environments where young people from ethnic minority backgrounds may get the opportunity to pick up an instrument, to practice for a little while. But the reality was, how could that be sustained? How could that be really developed if in the home environment and the parents who were bringing up those young people, they themselves felt isolated? So that sense of isolation amongst parents is something that many organisations are trying to tackle by bringing the parents into the domain. And what I found is that the El Sistema model had really had a positive impact on encouraging people who had not experienced any sense of going to a classical music concert or perhaps even listening to classical music in the home, had their first opportunity to experience Western European classical music in the context of a music education project. Now, I mentioned this, and it's not specific to ethnic minority communities. It's very much based on perhaps looking across the area of race, society, and exclusion. But there was quite a significant number of ethnic minority young people who were part of those projects. And they themselves and their parents generally had a positive impact. They felt the experience of being involved in learning classical music, learning an instrument, was a positive experience. Why was it a positive experience? I suggest that one of the things that young people may be looking for in their parents is not only the enjoyment of the environment and the genre, and it's exactly what Anna was talking about. Sometimes there is a perception that classical music can offer another response to a situation. It possibly can be something that offers young people the chance to, and their parents, to step out of their existing worlds. Now, in my research, it can go as deep in as depth as Anna's in terms of understanding the psychology behind how people might feel that they might want to fix themselves or change themselves. but the kind of impact on the journeys that they were taking seemed to be more proactively positive than negative. Another key question that we asked the various different focus groups was the idea of nurturing excellence, and was the question about quality and excellence something that they had discussed in their music making, or even in terms of their own educational backgrounds and their own educational journeys. And it was something that was really, it was a topic that was really quite a tricky one to handle, because this idea of excellence has many kind of connotations which people aren't ready to discuss sometimes. For many of I would classify them as perhaps aspiring middle class or aspiring families from ethnic minority backgrounds, this idea of excellence was actually quite a key topic. They had perhaps suggested that their young families had moved forward into learning an instrument as a way of not only increasing their perhaps life chances, but actually they saw a direct correlation between learning a classical music instrument and studying and being in that kind of system as a way to perhaps impact on their own academic and educational opportunities and also life chances. So that's something that the research kind of was fairly consistent across the ethnic minority groups. One thing that really came back from this research, though, was the fact that we really felt, in terms of the feedback we had, they really felt that a lot of the families were quite disappointed that somehow that in the general public domain, that people, the public, the media, would talk about young people from ethnic minority backgrounds learning classical music were perceived to be socially disadvantaged. That was something that people felt quite disappointed about. And whilst the statistics will demonstrate that there is a propensity for projects to want to encourage young people to learn classical music, let's say, it goes into environments and areas and into social environments where there is disadvantage. A lot of the, particularly African Caribbean and Asian ethnic minority parents felt that actually they had made a choice for other reasons, not for getting out of a social or a disadvantaged situation. What I'd like to move on to say now is that the main kind of posit for my piece of research was that the young people really felt that for themselves, and I interviewed several groups of young people, they felt that it was critically important for them to have something they could look forward to, and that often manifested itself in the role of people, individuals that they could look up to, who would inspire them. And the lack of perhaps role models, the lack of the Ayannas in the public domain, the lack of perhaps seeing an orchestra with a number of faces that were not from perhaps a kind of uniform part of society, was something that they felt was quite distracting for them. I remember a young musician particularly saying that she'd gone along to the LSSO and felt that, you know, whilst at first when she joined in the initial sessions, she felt that there wasn't really a support for her being there. She felt like she was the only person who could possibly be, from that background. It was important for her to feel that she was amongst her own community. And a lot of young people also said they felt much more comfortable. I kept up with about a third of the young people I spoke to, they said they felt much more comfortable being in an orchestra or an ensemble where it was really mixed and not perhaps so uniform in terms of its cultural mix. So my overall kind of feeling is that, yes, people want to see a better mix of diversity in orchestras, in ensemble music making. Yes, they want to be able to participate in schemes that will allow them to be really proactive, but they also felt that they needed to be able to have an opportunity to make music that was relevant and touch their hearts. And quite often, some of the music that they were perhaps brought to from schools was quite isolating and didn't have any relevance to their own cultural backgrounds, their interests, and their everyday lives. So I'd recommend that in our conversations today that we talk more about the repertoire and how the repertoire can be made more accessible, can be made more engaging, and resonate with young people and people who perhaps have not been brought up in the Western European classical music dynamic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Beverly. Lots to think about there. And before we have some more music, we're going to hear from Dr. Christina Chef, who is in fact the reason we're all here today, the engine behind this event. She recently won a prestigious funding grant, which this project is occurring under, to research the working lives of classically trained female musicians. And she's a lecturer here at King's in the Culture, Media and Creative Industries Department, and has a background looking at gender studies and feminism.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anna. Okay, so I'd like to do two things in my talk today, and they kind of relate nicely to Anna's talk and Beverly's talk and also Ayanna's performance. I want to shift the focus slightly on the classical music profession. So we've heard about education, we've heard about access to the profession, we've heard about repertoires and so on. My research is very much based on early career musicians, but also more widely the classical music profession. So what happens when people leave the conservatoire, basically. And so tonight I'd like to do two things. First is I want to very briefly map some of the inequalities in the classical music profession. But that's not the main thing I want to do. The main thing I want to do is to ask, why do these inequalities persist? And we've already heard about the history of classical music tonight, but also in the conference we had today, and the traditions in which classical music is embedded. I want to look more specifically at the classical music profession and what it's like to work in the cultural sector, to explore why inequalities persist. But first, what are these inequalities that we keep talking about tonight? So women, Black and minority ethnic players, and musicians from a working class background are underrepresented in classical music. We've already heard that with regard to ethnic minorities and working class musicians, their underrepresentation is due in part to issues of access to music education and also, importantly, bias within music education. By contrast, women and girls make up a high proportion of students on relevant degree programs. So despite this, they are underrepresented in the profession. So there's a big drop-off between the high number of women on degree programs and then the number of women who are represented in the profession. So my first point about inequalities is that there's underrepresentation. My second point, that is equally important, is that we need to look further than this. We need to look at who is represented where in the world of classical music. And more specifically here, I'm talking about what researchers call horizontal and vertical segregation. So vertical segregation is like that. It means that you have specific groups on top, so in positions of authority and prestige. Horizontal segregation, more like this, is that you tend to have specific groups, again, in particular sectors of a profession or actually the economy at large. So to make this a little less confusing, in classical music we tend to have women concentrated in teaching, so that's horizontal segregation, one part of the profession. Men, on the other hand, concentrated in composition, for example, or conducting. And this again maps onto different forms in which these ways of working in classical music are considered prestigious. So what's interesting is that 71% of music teachers in this country are female, but if you look at conservatoire teaching, which is much more prestigious, you have more men there. So this is vertical segregation. And what was really interesting was that the recent report published by the Arts Council England showed that 1 in 10 managers in the arts and cultural sector at large, actually less than 1 in 10 managers, is from a Black and minority ethnic background. So again, you find patterns of vertical segregations like this, you find fewer people from a minority ethnic background in positions of authority and prestige. And it would be really interesting to know what these figures are exactly for the classical music profession in terms of management, gender, race, and class. And I could go on about inequalities. There are further inequalities that, for example, relate to the sexualization of female players and the ways in which the body, more generally, in classical music maps on gender, race, and class in quite complex ways. But I'm actually just in the process of writing a research report where I try to map all these inequalities and to do so in accessible language. I'm going to tell you when it's ready, or please contact me if you are interested, because I want to disseminate it really widely, because we need to have some statistical data, I think, but also some basic research on these issues to campaign against inequalities in classical music and to put them on the agenda. But instead of continuing to map these inequalities, tonight I want to talk about why they persist. And I'm drawing on academic research on what it's like to work in the cultural sector, including classical music. Because I believe this research really helps us explain why some of these inequalities remain prevalent in classical music. So my point is, in order to understand some of these inequalities, we need to understand what it's like to work in classical music. So the first point to note is that work in classical music tends to be flexible, particularly for freelancers, and a lot of musicians, especially young musicians, work as freelancers. And often this is represented as an advantage, particularly actually for women who may want to combine having a family with a career. So the idea is kind of that you play the cello and next to you lies your little baby happily listening to your music. But we know from research that this idea is highly unrealistic. It's actually more difficult very difficult to combine flexible artistic work with domestic and child caring responsibilities. Alison Bain has done some really interesting research on female artists, and she's described how they found it really difficult working from home to find a space to work. So Virginia Woolf's saying a room of one's own, still applies today. But the issue of childcare is a bit tricky because we often hear that there aren't many women working in classical music and in the cultural sector and in other sectors because they have children. And that's true, possibly. It's incredibly difficult to combine having a career with having a family, especially in a country where childcare costs are obscenely high. But it's not the only reason. It presumes that women are the main caregivers and kind of reaffirms this link all the time instead of questioning this link. But also it doesn't quite grasp all the inequalities that are happening in classical music and in the cultural sector at large. So we have to look further than this. So one thing, for example, that we have to look at is the informality of the sector. You tend to get work because someone calls you. Rarely, do you kind of apply through a formal process. It's because of the people you know. So networking is very important to getting work in classical music. And networking is tricky, however. We know from research that networks disadvantage women, Black and minority ethnic players, and players from a working class background because they simply do not have access to the dominant and influential networks. We tend to network with people who are similar to us in terms of demographic background. The dominant and influential networks still tend to be male-dominated and white and Oxbridge-educated, upper middle class. And it's difficult to access these networks. So apart from the flexibility, the informality, and networking that is very common in the sector, a further stumbling block relates to constructions of creativity, and I think this applies in particular to questions around gender. So the myth of the artist is still often constructed implicitly as that of a male. And this means that women find it difficult to be taken seriously as artists in their own right, and I've heard that a lot in interviews I conducted with female musicians. And you can also see this when you think about where women are positioned in the industry. So we find them in teaching, which is a supportive role, a caring role, maps onto what we in the West believe are women and femininity are about. whereas composition, for example, is male-dominated, which is much more readily associated with creativity, genius, and talent. So constructions of creativity also matter. They go way back to the 19th century at least, and similar to traditions in music education, they are with us today. So one further important thing, and I've alluded to this in my introduction to this event, is that despite their prevalence, inequalities often remain unspeakable in classical music, and I would argue in many other areas of society, at least the ones that I've researched before. So there seems to be little awareness and open discussion of wider forces that shape musicians' working lives and careers in terms of the precarity of the profession, but also the inequalities that shape the profession. Instead, there's a very dominant discourse where success tends to be attributed to self-application, to talent, and to merit. So the idea is that if only you work hard, you're going to make it, is very prevalent. And this means that inequalities, the ways in which we are all affected by wider structures in society, they often remain unspeakable, perhaps even, perhaps people can't even imagine that they are there and how they might have an effect on us. But this means that it's difficult to detect these inequalities, to contest them, and to challenge them. And one really important thing I think we need to do is to make these inequalities speakable again. And exactly this is what I want to come to in my short conclusion now. So if we want to address inequalities, we have to focus on at least 3 issues. There's many more things we can think of. When I wrote this talk yesterday, that's what I came up with. So first, we have to collect more data to raise awareness that inequalities exist. And I mean this in particular in relation to the classical music profession. I was quite shocked as to how little data there is. Because this will give us a better understanding of what the issues are, exactly where intervention is necessary. It gives you, armor if you talk to people. It's always helpful to have a few statistics at hand, I find, in those contexts. So second, we have to put inequalities on the agenda. As I've said, inequalities are often unspeakable in the cultural sector, and we need to challenge this. And data will help with this, and hopefully also events like tonight's. And lastly, and crucially, I always say that structural issues such as inequalities need structural solutions. So individualistic interventions are unable to address inequalities that are social. What we need are more structural tools. I'm totally for blind auditions. I'm also totally for quotas. For example, we know from research from the US that when they started introducing blind audition, the quota of women orchestral players went up by 25%. This was only due to blind musicians. So formal and structural interventions bring about change, I would argue, and we need to understand this if we want to change something. Thank you. Okay, so Ayanna will come back. Actually, she is on stage already, but we'll hear her again. Just to say, follow Ayanna's mailing list. Also, Ayanna is selling a CD tonight, which she's going to sign here. So stick around afterwards and buy her CD. Thank you.
you don't have to put on a red light. Those days are over. You don't have to sell your body to the night and Roxanne. You don't have to wear that dress tonight. Walk the streets for money. You don't care if it's wrong or if it's right. Roxanne, you don't have to put on a red light. Roxanne, you don't have to put on that red light. I loved you since I knew you. I wouldn't talk down to you. I have to tell you just how I feel. I won't share you with another boy. You know my mind is made up. So put away your makeup. Told you once, I won't tell you again. It's a bad way. Oh, you don't have to put on that red light, no, Roxanne. You don't have to put on that red light, no, 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 no. You don't have to put on that red light, Roxanne. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. I know I'm a little bit silent over here, but it's always an important discussion. And I always just think in everyone's sort of different opinions, what's the root? What are we all hoping to achieve? And for me, sitting here, I'm hoping that it just means better music gets made, more people get to listen to it, just because there's quite a lot of opinions going on and you kind of get lost in what's the whole point? So from my perspective, it's kind of hoping that having greater diversity means you just come up with more things to enjoy, essentially. So I'll leave it there. I'm going to finish with a song called Unconditionally, which I wrote for my mum a few years ago. You are the source of my love, and you are the essence of truth, and you grow as I grow too, because nothing comes between me and you. I see you in me. More than just family. We are one eternally. unconditionally. Yes. You are the voice that makes things right. And you are the light that guides my path, oh yes. And you give everything you have. Thinking of me first and of you last. Oh, the hard roads you walked so I could fly, the dreams you pushed aside, all the time it took, the things you gave, the sacrifice, so I could rise. I see you in me, yes, I see you in me, yes, I see you in me, I see you, yes, I see you in me, more than just family, I see you in me, yeah. Ooh, I see you in me. I see you in me. Thank you.
Okay, it's kind of a hard act to follow. But our next speaker is Alice Farnham. She is course director of Women Conductors at Morley, a program to encourage women into the profession. She recently conducted the RPS, Royal Philharmonic Society, award-winning Paul Bunyan for Welsh National Youth Opera. Recent guest conducting includes St. Petersburg Mariinsky Theatre, Singapore Lyric Opera, and Grange Park Opera, Royal Ballet Covent Garden, Danish Royal Ballet, Birmingham Royal Ballet, and English National Ballet. Since 2005, she is on the guest music staff at the Royal Opera House and is director of Morley Opera School. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Wonderful, and indeed a very hard act to follow. So, in September 2013, I think you all know that Marion Alsop conducted the last night of the proms, and that was a first. And as she said in her speech, it's pretty sad that it's a first in 2013. Around that time, there was quite a lot of discussion about women conductors, some slightly unfortunate comments from some of my colleagues, which I think probably people know. Some Vasily Petrenko in particular, who said a cute girl on the podium is a little distracting. Having said that, he claims he was misquoted. So regardless of that, what was interesting about it was the fact that everybody was still talking about women conductors, whether they could be conductors. And it made me realize I had a light bulb moment when I was interviewed on the Radio 4, The World Tonight, And I said, I graduated from Oxford University 20 years before, and I at that point started thinking I wanted to be a conductor, and I assumed 20 years on that things would have changed, and it just appears that they haven't. And I realised it was time to do something about that. So, although things have changed a little, I think that the women that are out there conducting, there are a few, and they are doing really, really well, and that's something that we should be celebrating. And when I explain to people I'm starting this programme, they say, but there are women conductors, they exist, and nobody's denying their existence. It's just that they're still very much in a minority, to the point where they're not even considering applying to study postgraduate conducting, which is the first point when they really can start thinking about it very seriously. I think there are many reasons for this, and they're very, very complicated, and actually something that we touched on earlier is that classical music, and particularly conducting, is very unregulated in terms of how to progress in the profession. It's kind of unregulatable as well. Everybody has a different idea of what makes a good conductor. And it's very hard to actually audition for that kind of thing. So it's about who you know, it's the networking. But I felt that actually what we needed to do was start right back at the beginning and encourage young women to think about becoming conductors, because that just doesn't seem to be happening. So I went to Andrea Brown, who's here today, who's the head of music at Morley College, and I said, look, what can we do about this? And we got our heads together and we hatched a plan. So really what I wanted to do was, we wanted to normalise the idea of women conducting so that people don't always say, oh, a woman conductor. Oh, you know, I'm often introduced as a woman conductor. And I've had pretty extraordinary comments. I mean, this is anecdotal, this is not scientific, but I've had comments like, women can't conduct because their breasts get in the way. But how come you're a conductor, you're not a lesbian? Things like this, which are pretty shocking. And I laugh, I mean, you've got to laugh, but it would just be great if there were so many women conductors that people stopped saying things like that and they just got on with just deciding whether you're or not a conductor. I have to say, when I'm actually working, and I work as a conductor, I generally find orchestras don't really care whether you're a man or a woman. They just want you to do the job, and when you're doing the job, they really don't care. And that includes conducting in Russia at the Mariinsky Theatre. Nobody mentioned the fact that I was a woman. Nobody seemed to care about it. They just cared whether or not I could do the job, and I just got on with it. When I mentioned to one of my colleagues that I was setting up this course, one of my Russian colleagues, he said, great, like the suffragettes. He said, you have a history in Britain. So we started a pilot course in March where we contacted all the conservatoires around the country, and we got each of them to nominate somebody from their junior department. So we just focused on 16 to 19-year-olds. So most of the conservatoires around the country were able to nominate a student. We had 8 students, and we worked for 3 Sundays in March with very, very good repetitors, with string players, including somebody from the Royal Opera House, and we collaborated with the South Bank Sinfonia. I taught them, and I also had a body language, she's actually a stagecraft coach who worked with who normally works with singers, but I felt that we needed somebody to give young women some little tricks about how to stand in front of a group of people and to be confident and not to be seen as aggressive, to draw people in rather than fight with them, and to come across as confident. And we had that really made a difference. And actually I felt that if conducting is all about body language, I mean, what else is it about except body language? So it was very useful to have her, and she's going to be part of our future plans as well. We also got Sian Edwards in to give a very, very inspiring masterclass. Sian Edwards is head of conducting at the Royal Academy. I should say the Royal Academy is probably one of the most prestigious places to study conducting, so it's wonderful to have her there. I studied in St. Petersburg in the late 90s. Sean actually went out to Leningrad as it was then in 1983. So we have the same training, the St. Petersburg Ilya Musin School, which is very much about opening up, about expressing yourself through music. Incidentally, another Russian who taught women right the way through his career, and bearing in mind he was born in Tsarist Russia, it was a pretty long conducting teaching career, and he always taught women, although he was criticised for it. So our next plans are to do satellite courses around the country in all the conservatoires, and also targeting universities. We're very anxious that we've noticed a lot of conductors come from Oxford and Cambridge, so we're going to run courses there. We also, when we are at some places like the Royal Conservatoire Scotland, we're going to have we're inviting students from all the educational establishments that are running full-time courses. And we're focusing on women who want to be musicians. They're very serious about music and they really want to be musicians, but maybe they haven't considered conducting, or maybe they have considered. It's fine, but we really want women to start thinking about it a bit more. Then the next plan would be to have a little festival of women conductors at Morley College. This would include a masterclass with one of the leading conductors. We're not quite sure who yet. A keynote speaker, somebody maybe in a different profession, perhaps a comedian, a woman who is used to standing up in front of a group of people to just give them another perspective, and a round table discussion, which we'd like to do via the internet, of all the sort of leading women who are out there who are extremely successful, of which there are a few, but there's no way we can get them all in one place at one time, so we'll try to do something via the internet. And then finally, later on next year, probably about a year from now, we'll do some workshops focusing on the different aspects of conducting, so symphonic conducting, choral conducting, conducting for composers, because there are many composers who conduct their own works, but very few, if any, are women, although there are some great female composers around. Opera conducting, ballet conducting, and also conducting for teachers, youth orchestras, and doing outreach projects as well. Often there are a lot of women who are animators, but suddenly they're presented with having to conduct a small group of professional musicians, and they kind of get terribly worried about it. And then I think, looking further ahead, we would really like to set up some kind of mentoring scheme. The women that we're going to have women teaching on all these courses because we want to increase the role models and their visibility. And I think we would like to help women who maybe have trained as conductors, but they don't quite know how to network, what to do next. It's just great to be able to talk to another woman, because it's actually slightly different for women. It just feels different, and it's really nice to be able to have that opportunity. So that's our plans, and many, many more plans as well for the future, I hope.
Thank you very much, Alice. Okay, and our next and last speaker for the evening is Jessica Duchin. She is a classical Munich journalist, a novelist, and a playwright. As a journalist, she writes regularly for The Independent and has interviewed most of the world's finest musicians. Her work appears frequently in BBC Music Magazine, Opera News, Pianist Magazine, Classical Music, and The Strad, amongst others, and she contributes to BBC Radio 3. She has given pre-concert talks at Symphony Hall, Birmingham, the Barbican, Wigmore Hall, and the Royal Festival Hall. And Jessica's classical music blog has frequently been ranked amongst the world's top blogs of its kind. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's quite a tough act to follow everybody. What I'm going to do is, actually I found will follow on quite a number of points that particularly Christina and Alice have made, but also Ayanna and her beautiful, beautiful songs, and the point that you made about the way more diversity is actually better for us all because we get more music to enjoy. I think that's kind of really the crux of the whole thing. I've been a music journalist for about 25 years, so I feel I'm quite well placed to get an overview, if you like, of what's going on out there. And I'd just like to give you something of my perspective on the issue of gender inequality in classical music, from what I've seen myself, and some thoughts on where we go from here. Really, from the over-sexualization of young female soloists to a really serious underrepresentation of women at the top of professions like conducting and composing and parts of the whole business itself. I think sexism is a much bigger problem than it's being given credit for. The reason really is that we don't like talking about it. We're all a bit afraid to air things in a profession that is already rather beleaguered, and we don't want divisions amongst ourselves and our colleagues. I think that is something that can hold back the whole question of greater diversity. I finally lost patience with the whole thing when I went to the Gramophone Awards a couple of years ago. At the end of this very glitzy evening at the Dorchester, there were all the prize winners up on the stage having their photos taken. And what I was looking at was a group of white men in suits. There wasn't a single woman among them. It wasn't that no woman had actually been involved in any of those recordings, but the one female soloist who had won something wasn't there that evening because she had a concert. And the prominent women who were involved as singers or let alone orchestral players were not to be seen or referred to. And I got fed up and I thought, this is ridiculous. And I wrote a cross article, which got quite a bit of attention at the time. And I think since then, more of us have begun to think the unthinkable, which is that we can't just sit here waiting for things to change. We've actually got to get out there and do something. Of course, it is a big societal problem. Things like childcare are, as Christina said, absolutely obscenely ruinous in this country. And there are things that need to change at a much deeper level than our little corner of the music world, of the world in general, can possibly manage. But there are reasons why it matters for us. It's not just about us. It is about the art of music. And music, let's not forget, is why we are in this game in the first place, because we have a passion for this art that drives us and that illuminates our lives. It's something, it's very easy to lose sight of this sort of passionate involvement with an art. And I think it's important to keep that in our sights and not to lose contact with that huge love that we have for it. Now, music is, as an art, is supposed to be a meritocracy. And this is another reason that people object to the very notion of gender being an issue. But the thing is that it can't be a proper meritocracy if women are not getting enough of a look in. Unless there is a level playing field between women and men, there isn't a meritocracy. There's a word for this which I can't quite find, but it's a contradiction in terms. I've just been in Italy. I came back yesterday, visiting a chamber orchestra called Spira Mirabilis, which Alice may or may not be thrilled to find doesn't like conductors very much. They work without a conductor. But the orchestra's chief mover and shaker is a very dynamic, charismatic young woman. And in a way, she was leading the rehearsal that I looked at for 4 hours. On Wednesday afternoon. She was leading it very much the way a conductor would, but she was doing so from the leader's chair, the front of the first violins. So when I interviewed her, I asked her if she hadn't thought about becoming a conductor. She had everything. I mean, she would have been a very, very good conductor. She would have been a bit like Emmanuel Haïm, for example. And she said she hadn't thought about it. And I'm going to quote to you what she said. She said, all the great maestri I used to admire when I was a music student were men. And I just didn't have the image of a woman conductor in my mind. So in other words, she had no role model. I think role models affect us at such a deep psychological level that we don't always think to credit their importance to us. I think every female conductor I've interviewed has turned out to have a role model somewhere in her past, someone who's made her just accept somewhere in the deep consciousness that she has that standing up in front of an orchestra and directing a musical performance is something totally normal for her to do. Very often it's even a conductor of a youth orchestra or a teacher at school who conducted the school orchestra. But that's what makes it possible for her to progress in certain ways. And this is why the lack of women in those very top posts actually matters, because it becomes a self-perpetuating situation. Now, the argument some people offer is that it's all about artistic standards and that if women were good at conducting, they would have careers. Now, what I'd like to know in that case is how come there are so many male conductors in positions of great power, influence, and no doubt income, who I wouldn't cross the road to hear because they're really not very good at all. I mean, all I want is parity for lousy women conductors with lousy men conductors. It can't be that difficult. As Alice mentioned, there are also decision makers in the industry who say, oh, orchestral musicians don't like women conductors. And as Alice says, this is bunkum. My husband is an orchestral musician. Many of my friends play in the country's top orchestras. And they all say that's bunkum. All they want is someone who can do the job and do it well, and it's rarer than you think. Last year, I wrote another cross article because I saw a report on the British Composer Awards. They all went to men, every single one of them. Now, far be it from me to deny Harrison Birtwistle another prize. I mean, I dread to think of the state of his bookshelves. I mean, they must be groaning under his awards. And he's a great composer, and I don't want to take anything away from any of the fantastic, high-achieving, high-quality men in this profession. But I just think it is not right in the year 2013, as it then was, for women not to be getting that kind of a look in. So I investigated, and I was told by the head of BASCA, who was herself a composer, that they could only choose works that had been nominated for those awards. And not really enough awards, not enough works by women had been nominated. So then you start having to look at the nomination process. And I'm detecting a lack of confidence among women ourselves about putting ourselves forward for encouraging our publishers or our friends or our interpreters, our performers, to get out there and say, look, how about nominating me for this thing? I think men have naturally perhaps more sort of bullish confidence about this. In the meantime, my critic colleagues on the newspapers are helping nothing because they keep reviewing works by women in dubious terms like tinkling prettily, which is rather a suspect image to begin with. I don't think I've ever seen these words applied to a work by a man, but I have seen two very different works by two very eminent women composers. Sorry to say women composers, but the context is necessary. 2 in 2 years is a bit much, really. So perhaps it's no wonder that women can start to feel worn down by all this quite readily, and then you find that people are not even considering entering these professions. Now, change is not impossible. orchestras in this country are largely 50-50 male-female nowadays, and I think the same is true in America. And as Christina says, there's a reason for this. They didn't just sit there, they did something. They brought in auditions behind screens so that candidates could only be judged on their playing. So 25%, wasn't it? 25% more women started getting jobs in orchestras. I don't think that the London orchestras have screens. Certainly I don't think the LPO does. But they don't need to. It's become normal for women to have these jobs. It's so accepted that if a woman is the best player, or if a man is the best player gets the job. And this is the situation that is the ideal thing. It becomes so normal they don't even think about it anymore. Well, obviously, women have a historical disadvantage in classical music because we're talking about half a millennium of musical activity, through the vast majority of which women never had any hope or any opportunity to even be considered equal. Commentators of both genders, I think, often say that the place of women in the music world will evolve, will be sorted naturally because that's what society does. That'd be great if it was true. Women did not get the vote by sitting there waiting for it to happen. People had to chain themselves to railings. People threw themselves under horses' hooves to make society change. And if change is going to happen, as happened with the orchestras in a slightly more mild way, it was given a helping hand. Now, women are producing wonderful work all the way through the music business. It's propped up by armies of underpaid, undervalued women slogging away at the administration, yet only occasionally rising to the top. There are quite a lot of women conductors, but they don't get those top jobs that those lousy men I wouldn't cross the road to hear seem to get in droves. And unfortunately, the same is true for composers. We have Judith Weir now as Master of the Queen's Music, and Maren Alsop, who conducted last night at the Proms. But these pieces of news were headlines when they should have been no-brainers. I don't think that's evolution exactly. I think that is someone somewhere waking up and making an effort. So if we leave it to nature, I don't think it's going to happen. We're in a time of retrenchment at the moment. People are very insecure and very frightened, and that's when they become bigoted, insecure, aggressive. I feel that's what's happening in society generally right now. And if we're going to maintain a rational, enlightened sort of progress towards these ends, we'll probably have to do a little bit more. And we may have to think the unthinkable. I don't think any of us like the idea of quotas and positive discrimination and these kind of things. We want music to be about art. And quite right too, but the bottom line is that without parity between the genders, music can't be that meritocracy that we want. So it may not be inappropriate, in my view, for places like orchestras and publishers and opera houses and the great institutions around us to start thinking about introducing a quota or two, at least to get the ball rolling. Without those opportunities, a lot of incredibly talented people are just never going to have the chance to be heard. This used to be called consciousness raising. Anti-apartheid campaigners had to do that in South Africa. Even among those horrors, it was necessary. You could be immunized by day-to-day normalization of a very oppressed situation. And over here, we're very, very, very lucky. We often forget how lucky we are. But I think that gives us even more of a responsibility to build better foundations for the next generations. And I think we need to get out there and find a way to do it. And I take my hat off to women like Alice and Andrea and the Morley College crowd, everyone who in their own ways is finding those step-by-step ways to move things forward. Bravo, everyone, and keep at it.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Well, we can keep discussing these questions over wine. For now, I just wanted to thank Ayanna again for her brilliant playing, and all our speakers. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and to speak. And lastly, to the festival organizers, especially to Laura Douglas, do you want to wave so that people can see who you are? Thank you very much for doing a brilliant job. Thank you all for coming. The wine is over there. Help yourselves.